The following is taken from Edward Alexander's On Rome and the Gods, The Life and Works of Emperor Julian, available now on Amazon. On the 1st of December 355, having been unexpectedly appointed to his first official position as Caesar of Gaul, Julian departed for the western province in the company of a modest escort, only 4 of whom were drawn from his own attendants. Of these, quote, only one knew of my attitude towards the gods and, as far as he was able, secretly joined me in their worship. It was not to be an auspicious beginning to his appointment. As they arrived in Taurinorum, news reached him that Colonia Agrippina, the famous capital city of Lower Germania, had been overwhelmed and destroyed by a large force of Franks. Additionally, it was revealed that the imperial court had known about the disaster prior to his leaving, but had supposedly chosen to withhold the information from him lest it disrupt his preparations. It was the first indication that the authority of the new Caesar extended little beyond his title. As Julian perceived the situation, I was sent not as commander of the garrisons, but rather as a subordinate of the generals stationed there, for letters had been sent to them and express orders given that they were to watch me as vigilantly as they did the enemy, for fear that I should attempt to cause a revolt. From the moment Julian arrived in Vienna, he was kept under the strictest control and deprived of the means of making any present to his troops, a customary practice for rewarding one's soldiers. As disappointing as this may have been for him, the approach of Emperor Constantius was an entirely reasonable one. Julian had no experience of or training in military and public affairs. To invest such a person with unrestricted authority over a third of the empire, in a region famous for rebellions no less, would have been foolish. For the time being, his cousin's role was to be effectively ceremonial. He was to carry the banner of the Augustus and little more. Julian's response would come to define not just his time in Gaul, but the rest of his life. Rather than retreat into the comfort and security of his new stately residence, far from the din of battle, to delegate matters of war and statecraft to others, and to continue with his studies in relative seclusion, only venturing forth to perform the few duties expected of him, the young Caesar, more acquainted with books than arms, resolved to become worthy of his title. His scholastic education had left him, quote, in profound ignorance of the practical arts of war and government, and in order to correct this, he committed himself wholly to the venture from the moment he arrived. His first winter in Gaul would be one of transformation. He was to become a soldier and a leader. Having been abruptly dragged from the schools and into the clamour of arms, Julian arrived in Vienna a young man of slight build. It was therefore essential that he prepare himself physically. To this end, he undertook the training regime of a Roman military recruit, a demanding set of exercises which were to be performed every day without fail, typically in both the morning and the afternoon. Julian will have sparred with post and foil, the wooden gladius purportedly weighing more than its steel counterpart, thrown javelins and lead-weighted darts repeatedly without pause, felled trees, jumped ditches, swam in ice-cold waters, and marched at full step, or even ran, all in his war gear while carrying a burden of up to 20 kilograms. His commitment to becoming a soldier was not limited to military training, however. As in the case of the famous cynic Diogenes, of whom he would later write admiringly, Julian exposed his body to hardships in order that he might make it stronger than it was naturally. Each night he slept not upon a soft bed with silk sheets and a duvet, but a rug and coarse blanket, while throughout the winter he forewent the benefit of a fire in his bedchamber. As regards food, he seems to have been of a mind with Democritus, in that, quote, fortune provides a man's table with luxuries, virtue with only a frugal meal. For despite Constantius having made generous provision for his cousin's table, Julian rejected delicacies such as pheasant and sow's udders, subsisting instead on the basic diet of the common soldiers. This will have amounted to a simple ration of bread with some meat and, in the manner of his Gallic troops, a helping of beer. Before the close of winter, word reached Vienna that the ancient city of Augustodunum, a wealthy and popular settlement whose walls were extensive but crumbling with age, had been besieged by Alemanni. Only the vigilance of a small group of veterans had saved the city from being overwhelmed. the unfledged Caesar's first opportunity to participate in a military campaign was at last upon him. In keeping with his studious nature, Julian had taken to reading any available literature that might assist him in this endeavour, with Julius Caesar's Bellum Gallicum becoming a firm favourite, such that he considered it, quote, a necessary provision for campaigns. It would later be remarked that Julian marched with his books, for he always had in his hands either books or arms. On the 24th of June, he arrived in Augustodunum, eager to put his preparations into practice. The plan was to march to Ramorum, where they would rendezvous with the rest of the army under General Marcellus, who, having taken over from Ursicinus, ultimately held sway over military affairs in Gaul. A war council was held to determine which route ought to be taken, with Julian electing to take the shortest of the three options, the path that he knew would lead them through dense forest. The risk of ambush was considerable. Whether naive or bold, the young commander had no intention of shrinking from battle with the barbarians. With a small contingent of cavalry and artillerymen, Julian set off north at once, quickly reaching Altessiodurum without incident. After a brief rest, they began the long and far more challenging march to Drucassium. As they advanced, the column increasingly came under attack from German warbands using the forest as cover. By strengthening his flanks and repeatedly reconnoitring their surroundings, Julian minimized the threat of ambush. Then, when the terrain was favorable, he launched an assault which devastated the enemy and put the survivors to flight. Their subsequent arrival at Drucassium was so unexpected that the city, ever fearful of barbarian raids, hesitated before opening the gates to them. After another brief halt, they made their way to Ramorum without further engagements. For Julian, the success of this venture, his first taste of battle, will have assuredly given him confidence. For his troops, the significance of their Caesar marching into camp with various trophies of war should not be understated, for in the Roman conception, victory was more than a solely human event. Quote, the victory of a chief often assumed the features of an independent divinity. Through triumph in battle, the victor had become a force existing in an almost transcendent order, a force not of the victory achieved in a given moment of history, but, as the Roman expression stated exactly, of a perpetual or perennial victory. The following few months were dedicated to reclaiming territory west of the Rhine. While many settlements had been besieged, the Germans appear to have generally avoided taking up residence inside the towns themselves, viewing them as if they were, quote, graves surrounded with nets. The first to be retaken was Brotomagum. As the Roman army neared the town, an Alemanni horde met them in open battle. Julian drew up his forces in a crescent formation, outflanking the German host on both wings and inflicting heavy losses. Some of the survivors managed to flee, while others were taken captive. Thereafter, the Romans encountered little to no resistance. With the campaign season nearing its end, Julian elected to make the considerable journey northwards to reclaim Colonia Agrippina. The city had been left unoccupied and in a state of utter ruin. Once retaken, Julian remained for several weeks to refortify the settlement and conclude negotiations with the Frankish chiefs. His first campaign as Caesar had, by any measure, been a resounding success.